I'm going to ask Rod to do this section again of another section. We're currently going through a process of a minor restructure within the business, and that should be complete within the next 6 weeks or so. And so in the interim, I've got Rod covering a couple of bases. So thanks, Rod.
Okay, thanks, Greg. So looking at, again, the highlights for this year, I think you can see what the text is on the slides. I think biosecurity planning is a very big area for the business, and there's lots of biosecurity plans being developed, implementation meetings and reference panels. And certainly from a PHA perspective, the implementation meetings and the reference panels are a very good way of allowing the biosecurity plans to be actually implemented and for high priorities for industry and government to be identified to go forward. The other one that's a key on that slide is the Biosecurity Preparedness portal, which picks up again on one of the issues that was raised in the member survey, where industry and government members wanted shared document information systems, and this is one of those systems. So it's an area where we're going to be putting the biosecurity plans, contingency plans, information on high priority pests, etc. But one of the interesting discussions we had at the subcommittee Domestic Quarantine and Market Access last week was government was asking if they could set up sites to store information on national significant pests. For example, PCN was one of them, because when people change business areas in governments, they leave government. Governments with machineries of government change their names, change their organisations, and they say going back 5 or 6 years when a national document was developed, it's sometimes very hard for them to find it in their internal systems. And they were wondering whether the portal could be used as a site to hold some of these nationally significant documents, I think, which would be a very, very good use for it. So the next part of this is, again, the bee biosecurity program. It's one of the more successful biosecurity programs we run. It's very well, maturing quite effectively now. Queensland's the only state that we're still trying to negotiate a contract for a bee biosecurity officer. The other bee biosecurity officers are all being quite effective in their roles. And we're getting to a point now that some of the states and territories are starting to introduce components of the Code of Practice into their legislation. When ARBIC first went down this path, they were quite keen to they were initially optimistic that all the code would be picked up by legislation, but there is difficulties in government doing that. But certainly the key aspects of the code are now being picked up in jurisdictions legislation, which is a very important issue. And one of the things that we've formed following on from that is we've now formed a new committee in the bee space, the National Bee Harmonisation Subcommittee, and that's looking at how we can ensure that the bee legislation across all states and territory is harmonised and it does all reflect the same sort of outcomes. And that's important for the bee industry. As you all appreciate, bees move from Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia on a regular basis, depending on flowering plants and also on pollination services. And so moving between states with different legislative requirements is quite a challenge for the industry. And there's a willingness in both government and industry to move forward in that space. The other area on this slide is the bee health and resources. We undertook a survey on behalf of ARBIC this year, and we've got 4,000 odd responses. And most of the respondees, there was a mix of commercial beekeepers and hobby beekeepers, and most of them knew about the code. Most of the respondents were actually looking in their hives at bee pests, but we did discover there was a very little understanding of exotic bee pests. So that's an area that we can go forward in the coming 12 months, and it's a survey that we'll be continuing again. So also in the fruit fly space, some of the fruit fly work outside the council activities sits in this area of the business. And you can see, I think one of the highlights, certainly from my point of view, being in this space for a long time, any of you that are involved in fruit fly will know that there's a code of practice for Q fly, a code of practice for med fly. They were both developed in 1996. There has been at least 3 or 4, maybe 5 attempts to refresh those codes, and they've hit hurdles every time. Plant Health Committee at their December meeting approved the new fruit fly codes, and it's now called the Australian National Fruit Fly Management Protocols. And Department of Agriculture and Water Resources are now negotiating with our international trade partners to accept the new approach. And once that's done, that will allow us to do a whole lot of changes to the code. We can add new lures, new trap types, we can add new pests, we can add things like area-wide management, etc., which aren't in the current codes. And it's also in a style and dynamic state that we can go to trade partners and just change one small document rather than the whole document itself. So that's quite a major change. And the government parties are all keen for industry to have access to that, which is something industry hasn't had in the past. And again, that will come forward as we progress this project. There's been work, Daryl Barber's done a lot of work on the spotted wing Drosophila, and that's a really good example of a significant pest overseas, which we're trying to get prepared for in Australia. And there was a workshop ran where they brought over international exports that talked exactly how that pest could behave in Australian situations. We've been asked by the Victorian Agriculture Department to undertake a national phylloxera review. At the present time, there are national standards for phylloxera and how you declare pest-free areas and risk zones and infected zones, but they're a bit dated. There's not a national coordination of those around, and they've asked us to use the bee code of practice and the bee biosecurity programs as a base to look at developing a national phylloxera project. And we're just at the early stages of that project at the moment. We've talked to the phylloxera people in South Australia, and we're shortly going down to talk to the Victorian industries, both the infected areas and the non-infected areas. And then we'll be liaising with all the states and territories with their wine, table and dried fruit industries to get their views on whether they would support or not support a national phylloxera program and what that could look like. The other part to that, you've seen that this biosecurity response preparedness for the grains industry continues with permits being lodged to APVMA, and we've participated in some traceability workshops the Department of Agriculture and Water Resources are running. And I think from my perspective, the department's trying to take a sensible approach in that space, and they're not trying to develop a one-size-fits-all. What they're trying to do is they're saying our trade partners are asking for more and more detail on traceability, and they're wanting systems that are used by industry, for industry, to be able to be adopted by the Australian government and used as examples to our trade partners. Look, Industry X has got this in place and it does provide that traceability. Many of you have seen information that I've sent out on these as the workshops are being held. Again, one of the issues that came out of the member survey was members asked for improved traceability, and this, along with PICS, is one of the processes to do that. So for the key drivers for next year, a lot of the programs will continue. The biosecurity planning program, for example, continues, but the focus on implementation, reference panels, new plans changes as each year goes by, and you'll see that in the AOP when we present it to you for consideration. And the reference panels, etc., will be continuing as they are now. The bee program will be continuing, and I think one of the key aspects of the program for next financial year will be PHA will be working with ARBIC to undertake a review of the program. We met with ARBIC yesterday, and they've reinforced their commitment to keeping the program running post this next financial year and into the future. But we are going to be looking at as to whether they want to change the focus, change emphasis on where the program's heading at the present time. I mentioned earlier the survey was going to be, the Health and Resources survey was going to be redone annually. And the idea is that the ARBIC want to try and get a sort of a line that shows that, hopefully it shows, that the industry is getting more and more aware of the code of practice. They're getting more and more aware of how to inspect their hives. And of course, they're getting more and more aware of what exotic pests they should be looking for. The other projects that are on that slide will continue into next year as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rod. I noticed that my team here are still not typing or writing furiously, so we've obviously got no questions. No need to be shy. We don't mind a few questions. So if anything triggers your interest, please don't hesitate to just flick a question in or send a text.